Hi, I'm Space Kate and welcome to Need to Know Space. Today we're going to tackle that tricky topic of the Boeing Starliner test flight and find out whether the astronauts really are stranded in space. Okay, there's a lot to discuss here, but let's just cut to the chase. Are the astronauts stranded on the International Space Station? No. Okay, that was easy. Now I could just stop there. No, they're not stranded. Done. But actually, I don't think that's very helpful. The important thing here is for you to really understand what is going on with the Starliner program, this test flight, and why these headlines have come about in the first place. Then we can work out what's really going on. So let's go back to basics. I've opened up my dictionary and I've had a look at exactly what it means, the word strand. So, to strand means to leave someone helpless without transport or money, for example. Well, they're in space, so money doesn't really matter at this point, but without transport. Is that correct? Are the crew of the Boeing Starliner crewed flight test, Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams, stranded in space? Do they have no transport to get them back to Earth? Well, quite simply, no. If there was any kind of emergency, say a piece of space debris was heading towards the station and they needed to undock and get home, well, they could just jump into Starliner, undock and get home. But Starliner is only cleared to return to Earth in case of an emergency. Therefore, they're stranded. I mean, you could say that, but if you say that, then you have to also realise that the SpaceX Dragon capsule, which is also currently docked to the International Space Station, is also only cleared to undock and come back to Earth in case of an emergency. So they're all stranded. Panic, panic! No. Again, as the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy would say, don't panic. The reason that they are not cleared for return to Earth is because there is a process. There are some hoops that you need to jump through. And it involves lots of data, lots of checks. NASA doesn't take human spaceflight lightly. You know, if they're going to say it's okay for our astronauts to come back down from space on a vehicle, they want to be really certain that everything is tip-top and there isn't anything that's going to go wrong. So in any case of any vehicle, American vehicle, undocking from the space station, they go through something called the Return Readiness Review. And that requires lots of data so that everybody understands everything about the spacecraft before they give a final go, no-go for undocking. You could say that all the astronauts are stranded on the International Space Station, or you could just say they haven't gone through the Return Readiness Review because they're not ready to come home yet. Okay, Kate. But this Return Readiness Review, that's just a technicality, isn't it? Dragon has flown people up to the space station and brought them safely home several times, so you're just making excuses, aren't you? Well, no, actually. To be honest, I'm a stickler for the correct usage of words, and the word stranded, as we described earlier, means that somebody is helpless and left without, say, transport. So let's just play out the scenario to the worst case. If Starliner couldn't bring the astronauts back home safely, and I'm not in any way suggesting that that is the case, but if that were the case, would that then mean the astronauts are stranded on the International Space Station? Again, the answer is no. And the reason for that is that when the Space Shuttle program ended and NASA looked to commercial companies to provide transport of both cargo and crew to the International Space Station, they chose two different companies. So they have two different options of getting astronauts to and from the station. And the reason they did this, the term you'll hear quite often in the space industry, is dissimilar redundancy, as in having a backup, but having a backup that is different from the original that you have. So if there was an issue with a piece of equipment, that same issue wouldn't knock out your backup as well, because they're not the same. And that's the case with Dragon and Starliner. There are two different options now for getting astronauts to and from the space station. And if Starliner, for some reason, was no longer there, no longer able to bring Butch and Sunny home, well, you could just launch another SpaceX Dragon capsule and bring them home that way. So, are they stranded? With the definition of the word stranded, absolutely not. But they were supposed to only be up there for a week, and they launched on the 5th of June, and that means they've been there for over a month now, so they must be stuck, right? Again, well, not really. There was never actually a strictly defined length of this trip. And while they're up there, they are collecting hugely valuable data. Data that there's no way that you could collect on Earth because, well, it's not space. So they're making the most of this test flight. And remember, that's what this is. It's a test flight. You have 2 veteran Navy test pilots who are piloting the Starliner test flight. And interesting to note, and important to note, Sunny Williams becomes the very first woman to be a test pilot on the first flight of an orbital spacecraft. Nice one, Sunny. Now, let's just see how on earth did we get into this situation where there are so many headlines now talking about these astronauts that are stuck and stranded. Let's get into a bit more detail about this mission, what it means, why it's happening, and why people have ended up getting so confused. Now, I've got plenty of experience pitching to editors, and if they don't really understand the subject or are not quite as passionate about it as perhaps you and I might be, the question is always, but why should I care? And so if you can come up with some drama, if a headline writer can put in a bit of jeopardy that's more likely to bring the clicks and the readers, then that's what they're going to go for. It's what they do. It's because that's the kind of thing that people click on, unfortunately. So I do blame the media for making it a little bit more overhyped and overdramatic than it really is. Yes. But is it totally their fault? No, I don't think so. I think perhaps the way that things have been communicated out by Boeing and NASA, it hasn't been the greatest. They haven't been able to just come out like I have and say, no, they're not stranded. Yes, we know that there are tests for the thrusters. Yes, we have had some updates, but I don't think they've always been quite as clear as they could be. And so I won't 100% put the blame there with the media. I don't think it's entirely their fault. I think it's kind of a mixture of different reasons that we've got to the situation that we're in. And another reason that we cannot ignore, it's Boeing and its reputation. The issues that it's had with its aeroplanes have left Boeing's safety reputation absolutely in tatters, and rightly so. But the Boeing space section is different from the aircraft section, and they're working with NASA. They will not be able to get away with anything shoddy because there is somebody looking over their shoulder, absolutely checking the data, making sure that everything is done as it is supposed to be done. Because these are people's lives that we are talking about, and not only their lives, it's the space program itself. If there were another big disaster, if there were some threat to funding, that would have huge, huge issues for NASA. And so that's why they are so careful about everything that they do and how important it is that they don't fail in their missions. That's why they have the dissimilar redundancy. They're able to take slightly more risk than they used to by working with commercial partners like SpaceX, but it's not the same as stopping caring about things. They are still heavily involved in these missions, and they would not be doing anything that would put lives at risk. I'm pretty certain about that. Now, while I'm here to reassure you that the astronauts are not stranded on the International Space Station, I'm not here to tell you that everything has been plain sailing with Starliner. By the time Starliner's first crewed test flight flew, it was actually just over 4 years since SpaceX had done the very same thing. And in that time, as you know, SpaceX Dragon has been taking people up and down to the space station, and that program seems to have been going really well. So why even bother with a second one? Again, it's this issue of dissimilar redundancy, and that's why America wants to have 2 different systems for getting humans from the surface of the Earth safely into orbit and docking with the International Space Station. Boeing Starliner is currently going through its certification process, and this current flight that it's on, the crewed flight test, it's absolutely crucial to find out all the information, work out any issues, iron out the creases before they get the certification that it's a human-rated vehicle. And once they get that, it can go into circulation with SpaceX, and they'll take it in turns to send crews up to the International Space Station. So on this particular flight, there were a number of issues they had before launch. One was actually with the rocket itself, so nothing to do with Starliner, and that caused a delay. There's also been an issue with a helium leak, but they decided it was okay to fly. And on the third attempt, they did manage to get off, up and into space. Once they were in space, they had some then new issues to deal with some of the thrusters not firing properly, and this caused them to stop before they did the docking with the International Space Station, because again, there is nothing worse than getting all the way up there and then accidentally smacking into the International Space Station and ruining everything for everyone. That wouldn't be allowed to happen, and indeed there is a very strictly managed keep out zone that surrounds the International Space Station. So before they were allowed to go into that zone, they had to confirm that they had full control of the vehicle, that everything was running and the backups were sufficient to ensure they would be able to keep control of the vehicle. The vehicle docked autonomously with the International Space Station, and that was fine. And we heard in a press conference from Butch that it was an absolute dream to fly. He said the handling of the vehicle was, the precision was excellent, but he really could tell the difference when there were some issues with the thrusters. Now, they originally had issues with 5 thrusters, and when I was watching this on the live stream, I was kind of worried. That sounds like a lot of thrusters. It was 5 out of 28 of the reaction control system thrusters, and they were all on the same side of the vehicle, so that could have been a bit tricksy. But they managed to refire the thrusters, and out of those 5, 4 of them came back online and seemed to be working well enough that it was considered safe to allow the vehicle within that no-go zone and dock with the International Space Station. The 5th one didn't return, and the system just deselected it. There are, again, lots of redundancies. These ones are not dissimilar redundancies, but they have a redundancy in the number of thrusters that they have to ensure that they have a backup in case something like this happens. So it's a big deal. Like, anything going wrong is not great in space, but it's not a deal breaker. They were still able to get to the space station and dock correctly. And they're now doing lots of tests, both in space and on the ground, to try and work out what it was that had gone wrong with that thruster. It sounds like it could be a thermal issue, perhaps down to the fact that the thruster itself had pulsed more times than they were expecting and got hotter than expected, perhaps because for some time it was pointing directly at the sun, and that could have also increased the temperature. So there are lots of things they're trying to get to the bottom of and work out, and that's what they're doing before Starliner comes back home. Not least because they want to understand everything that they can about these thrusters before they decide whether it's okay for Butch and Sunny to come home. That's the data they need for that return readiness review that I spoke about earlier. But also, these thrusters are a part of the vehicle that won't exist by the time Butch and Sunny step onto solid ground back on Earth. And the reason for this is that the service module element of the vehicle is jettisoned and it burns up in Earth's atmosphere. That means there's no way that any engineer can get their hands on, tinker with it, poke it and press it and see exactly what it was that had gone wrong, because it'll be gone. There's no way to get that information. So that's why they're extending the mission. They're learning everything they can about these thrusters while they're up in space, and they're on the ground trying to recreate the conditions, the stress conditions that those thrusters were under while they were in space. A small snag with that is they haven't yet managed to put the ground-based thruster under quite as much thermal stress as the one in space. So that's something that they're looking at the moment, but in the press conferences they have discussed the number of simulations that they have done, and they have said that even if all 5 of those thrusters were out of action for the mission home, they would still be able to safely land. So that's really great news. And we heard from Butch and Sunny, they both sound confident not only in the vehicle, but in the data collection, the tests being done, and the people who are going to be making those decisions for the return readiness review and that final go, no-go poll to see when they come back home. They're friends, they're colleagues, they're people that they know and trust, and that was something that Butch said when they were talking to journalists from the International Space Station just the other day. So they seemed quite happy, and they also said they were confident if in an emergency they had to jump into the Starliner and come home, in that scenario, that they were confident it would all be fine and they would get home safely. So that's really great news. anything to do with human spaceflight is difficult and scary and risky. So it's all about the amount of risk you're prepared to take, and on a test flight that you're on a vehicle that hasn't flown with humans on it before. So again, there's always an extra sense of nerves around watching a launch and a landing. You know, when I first watched the Dragon capsule launch and land, I was nervous watching that because it had never been done before, and no matter how much you test and retest, you don't know exactly what's going to happen until you put something up in space. So I will be watching the landing of this capsule, you know, slightly nervously, as I'm sure the whole team will be, because it's their friends who are on that vehicle coming back down from space, and everybody wants to make sure that they get back safely. Now, an interesting thing about Starliner is it's the only American capsule that is not landing in the sea. All of the early space program capsules, and indeed the Dragon capsule, splash down in the ocean under parachutes that help slow them down so that the touchdown or splashdown is not quite so violent for the astronauts inside. Well, other than the space shuttle, which landed more like an aeroplane, no other vehicle has tried a land landing. And that's what Starliner is going to be doing. So again, that's going to be quite an interesting one to watch. The Soyuz capsule lands on the ground out in Kazakhstan, and they send out a crew to helicopters, and they pick the crew up from the Kazakh steppe when they land. And as that comes down, and you generally see a big puff of dust and smoke, and you might think, oh my goodness, they really hit the ground very, very hard to make that kind of debris. But that's usually the kick up from the retro thrusters that are doing the final slowdown of the Soyuz before it hits the ground. And there's a kind of classic best wishes type saying that you would have for people on a Soyuz, and you wish for them to have soft landings. So we wish the same for Butch and Sunny, that they will have a soft landing. The system that Starliner uses is rather different from Soyuz, and instead of having those retro thrusters, they're going to inflate a rather large pillow, and that's what they'll sort of land on, and then that will stop the hard hit of the ground. So we'll be looking forward to that. Now, I'm not going to try and tell you everything with Boeing Starliner has been plain sailing, because that's not quite the case. We know that spaceflight is hard, and that's why you do tests. Unfortunately for Boeing, their original orbital flight test, there was an issue with the mission elapsed clock, and that prevented it from fulfilling all of the mission objectives, namely getting up to the International Space Station and proving that it could autonomously dock, undock, and return safely to Earth. Now, because of this issue, NASA required them to repeat that orbital flight test before they would put astronauts onto Starliner. Now, you might think, oh my gosh, what a waste of taxpayer money, but actually, thing to note here, if you're an American taxpayer and this sort of stuff bothers you, Boeing didn't get paid anything extra to do that test. It actually cost them in the region of $410 million in order to repeat that test. So they picked up the tab on that, not you. That second test, again, had many delays before it was able to fly. There were issues with some valves. There was an issue with the International Space Station after a Russian module misfired and didn't quite put the station into a spin exactly, but not too far off. Anyway, they finally managed to get that one done and dusted, and we've waited until now to have the crewed flight test number 1. In fact, when this test actually launched on the 5th of June this year, it was almost 4 years to the day since SpaceX had done their original crewed test flight. We know since then that SpaceX has been happily taking astronauts to and from the International Space Station and will be doing so. So America does have human launch capacity in the form of the SpaceX Dragon, and now they're looking to back that up with Starliner being certified also for human spaceflight. Now, in order to be certified, they need to run through all of these tests, including this crewed flight test. And the data that they collect from this test is what will allow them to progress on the process of getting properly certified and then having their vehicles enter rotation, with Dragon taking crews up and down to the International Space Station. So, in theory, it should be a Dragon mission, and then the next one will be a Starliner mission, and that'll be followed by a Dragon mission. The first date, no earlier than date for Starliner 1 would be in February next year, 2025, although depending on the results of this flight test and some other elements that need sorting out, that could be pushed to later in the year. SpaceX has been double booked to cover that mission, so if there is any issue, there's not actually an issue with getting a crew up to the space station, and that's the beauty of having two vehicles that can do this. That's literally what it's meant to do. So let's talk a little bit about this crewed flight test. It took 3 attempts before they finally managed to get this spacecraft up into space. Initially, there was an issue with the rocket itself, so nothing to do with Starliner. You can't blame Boeing for that one. There were also some issues with some valves and some helium leaks, and they decided it was okay to fly with those. And finally, they set off up into space on the 5th of June this year. Now, the helium leaks, although on the ground were decided they wouldn't be an issue, unfortunately a few more of those have sprung up while they've been in space. In fact, I think we're up to now 5 different helium leaks, and engineers down on the ground are going to be looking at the data, trying to work out what it is that is causing these things to leak. And there are a few suggestions that are being discussed at the moment. Was it to do with some foreign object debris that had got in under the seal? Was there perhaps too much grease put in around the seal? Or was it just that the seal itself is made out of the wrong material or isn't quite big enough to do its job? All of those things are being looked at. They're trying to understand the root cause of that problem, and that will be changed in advance of the Starliner first operational flight. Okay, but it's a leak, and that sounds bad. You don't want a leak. Does that mean that's going to stop them coming home? Well, I think if the leak was a real concern to anybody, they wouldn't have extended the mission quite as long as they have. And the reason for that is it's the helium that is keeping the fuel in the right place to enable the thrusters to fire on the way back home. And if they were concerned there wasn't enough helium to the point that it would affect whether a thruster could fire or not, they wouldn't be waiting up there any longer than they absolutely had to, because they wouldn't want to waste any of that extra helium. So I'm quite confident that they're all fine. There is plenty of helium there to ensure that the thrusters will fire, so long as the thrusters themselves are in good working order. One of the other issues we saw on this flight was on the way to the International Space Station, just ahead of docking with the station. It was discovered that there were an issue with some of the thrusters. In fact, it went up to 5 different reaction control system thrusters. So these are the ones that control the attitude of the spacecraft. Now, when we talk about attitude, we're not talking about whether it's having a grumpy day or it's, perfectly friendly. We're talking about the direction in which the spacecraft is pointing. And that's really important because you want to, especially on the way back, because if the spacecraft is not pointing in the right direction and then you set off the thrusters, say on the back of it, you're going to go in the wrong direction. And you don't want that on the way home. So is this a big concern? Well, when I was watching the live stream for the docking, I was quite concerned to see that number of thrusters had a problem, and it did seem quite a worry because they were all on the aft side of the spacecraft. They have looked into this. They're doing a lot of data collection and studying the thrusters back on Earth. They managed to get, of those 5, they managed to get 4 of them working again. Perhaps not to their full extent, but they were able to get them started again and get them working. One thruster didn't seem to want to come back to life, so they just deselected that from the system, and they have a redundancy in that system. So if one of them goes out, there are other ways that the thrusters can work together to make up for the loss of that one. In fact, they've done some simulations back home to check what would happen if all 5 of those thrusters were unable to be used on the way back home from space, and those simulations have shown that the vehicle would still manage to get back home without a problem. So they're doing all that they can to learn everything about the thrusters. They're trying to recreate the conditions from space on the ground to see what it was that might have happened to one of the thrusters. They've chosen the one that was the most badly affected by heat stress, thermal stress, and they've tried to recreate that on the ground. Interestingly, they've not actually managed to get the thruster as hot as it had been in space. So they're wondering what it was that caused it to get quite so hot. It could be that there were additional pulses of the thruster that they hadn't done before, and also that they were pointing kind of directly at the sun for a short while. So that could have had an effect, but these are all things that they are looking at, trying and testing. I think the key thing that they're really just checking for is if under those conditions, has there been any physical damage to the thruster, and could there be any physical damage to the other 4 thrusters that might cause an issue on the way back. They are still confident that they can bring Butch and Sunny home on Starliner without a hitch, without an issue, and if there was any concern about that, there's no way that that spacecraft would be cleared for unblocking and return. One of the things that was mentioned this week in a press conference was this idea that there is a chance that they do something in a ground test on a thruster that makes them realise there's something they want to test up in space. Now, the way I like to think about this is if your partner's just gone down to the supermarket and they ring you up and say, oh, hang on, can you just check, this is the ground test, can you check what's in the fridge if in case there's anything else we need? And then you say, actually we need some cheese. Well, they're still in the supermarket and they can easily pick up the cheese before coming back. This is kind of the same thing. They're checking some stuff on the ground, then they'll do any tests, further tests, while they're up in space. Now the difference is, of course, it's easy enough to pop back to the supermarket if you forget the cheese. Whereas once Butch and Sunny are back on the ground, the element of the spacecraft being tested will have burned up in the atmosphere. So it's game over. They have to do those tests right now, otherwise they won't get the information that they need and want. This might be a strange metaphor to use, but in the case of an unexplained death, the coroner will not release the body for cremation until they've worked out the exact cause of death. And it's the same reason. I mean, it's literally the same reason. If you allow a body to be cremated, that's it. There's no going back. It's burned up. There is no way to get any of the evidence or data about what it was that caused them to die. In the same way, with the thrusters, if they don't get that data before the thrusters re-enter the atmosphere and burn up, that's it. They won't be able to easily tell exactly what happened. Now, you might have seen people calling for the whole Boeing Starliner thing to be scrapped. Just send Elon to go and rescue them from the space station. Send up a Dragon capsule and bring them home safely. Well, it is technically an option, as we've discussed. They could, if Starliner was totally out of action, bring up a Dragon capsule and bring Butch and Sunny home safely that way. The thing is, they don't need to. We are not at that stage right now. So I'm sorry if you like a dramatic story and I have just been a spoilsport and taken all the energy and excitement out of it and made it all a little bit too technical for you. But here's the thing. This isn't a movie script. This is real life. These are real people and they have families and loved ones down here on Earth who are waiting for their safe return. So I think it's important for them, for everybody, to realise actually it's not quite the doom and gloom and disaster story that some people like to make out it is, but of course there are still tests and checks that need to be done before they get cleared in that return readiness review to come home safely back to Earth. Well, on that note, I will say goodbye and wish Butch and Sunny a very soft landing. And now you know what you need to know. Please do like, share and subscribe to this channel. I'll do my best to bring you updates on the latest news and just make sure you know what's going on in the industry.